Beauty can be light, loving and protective, yet beauty can also be dark, scary and malicious. So enjoy this week's case analysis with me, Dr Fiona Girkin. I specialise in dark personalities of women and the tactics they use to get what they want. Today we're going to discuss the case of Elizabeth Holmes. Now, if you don't know who Elizabeth is, we'll say that she's a cautionary and fascinating tale of someone's ability to lie about both their capacity to undertake a task, but also to lie and manipulate people to gain funding for a product that did not work. So Elizabeth was actually the CEO and founder of a company called Theranos. Now, her plan was to create this company that could do blood testing with just a simple prick of the finger, that hundreds of blood tests could be done with not needing a large needle jabbed in your arm. If you don't like needles, I'm not fond of them. I certainly never look when I have blood tests. And that was her reasoning for doing this technology, that many people don't like blood tests. And if you could just, with a simple pin prick, much in the same way someone might be tested for diabetes, you could have blood tests done. It would be less invasive and you could get the tests that you needed. It was found after a number of years that the technology she was creating actually didn't work, and that she'd continued to raise funds for her company to develop this technology, but that she was actually having blood tested through conventional machines rather than through her technology. So in the discussion of this case, I'm going to describe the case. We're going to have a look at some of the behaviours that she displayed, and we're also going to have a look at those behaviours against the dark traits such as psychopathy, narcissism and Machiavellianism. So Elizabeth Holmes founded Theranos in 2003, and she was just 19 years old at the time. She'd recently dropped out of Stanford. It was later reported in her court case, because she has actually been charged with fraud, that she dropped out of Stanford after experiencing assault, but that she also felt that she didn't need the teachings of Stanford to actually start this company and design this technology. And really the thought of being able to develop technology where you could do blood testing with a pinprick was quite revolutionary, and she knew how to talk, she knew how to convince people that she could design this product. So in 2014, this was 11 years after the company started, she'd raised $9 billion from investors to design this technology. But 11 years on, the technology still did not work, but people were not aware of that, hence why they were still investing. Holmes was at one stage called the darling of Silicon Valley. She was labelled as this amazing woman who'd started this company and at such a young age, and she was going to change the world. She actually saw herself as the next Steve Jobs and actually used to dress like him. She would wear tops that looked exactly like Steve Jobs. She would tie her hair back, and she even deepened her voice so that she would sound more like Steve Jobs. But her entire dream was definitely built on deception, and once investigation started and there were a number of staff that were whistleblowers that spoke about what they were seeing and that the technology didn't work, investigations were done, and that was when it was discovered that they'd been cheated. So in 2018, Theranos was actually dissolved, and in 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was actually convicted of 4 counts of fraud and sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in prison. Obviously, there's a lot more complexities to this story, and there's plenty of podcasts out there. There's a podcast called Bad Blood you can listen to, and it goes into quite a lot of detail around this case. But for me, I really want to just focus on the actual behaviours that Elizabeth displayed that potentially were psychopathic, narcissistic or Machiavellian in nature. So looking at the case, there appears to be 5 really key troubling leadership styles that she demonstrated during her time as the company owner and CEO of Theranos that came out in interviews with staff and through the investigation of the police. So first of all, I'll go through the 5 key first. So the first one was silencing anyone that wanted to actually speak out about the problems going on at the company and the lack of transparency. She used manipulative leadership and manipulated the staff as well as the investors. She used surveillance and paranoia to keep people contained, to not share the information that it wasn't working, and some described the workplace as quite toxic. She used emotional detachment and image control. So in the public, she seemed like a very vivacious and entrepreneurial person who cared about people, and that's why she was designing this technology. But that was not the case underneath. And the fifth one was using board manipulation. So creating a high-profile board that allowed for her to manipulate what was happening, manipulate the investors, and actually control the narrative to the board so that they constantly stayed engaged with her and believed in what she was going to achieve. So let's go through each of those individually. So silencing people. So Holmes was reportedly fostered a culture of secrecy and fear. So if any employees raised concerns, they were intimidated or fired as a result. Some people spoke about being followed, having legal letters sent to them, and being surveillanced quite heavily. All the staff had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, so there was no transparency. They couldn't talk about anything, otherwise they feared either losing their jobs or feared being prosecuted. Elizabeth was very manipulative. She was very charismatic and came across as very likeable, which is a very psychopathic trait, where you come across as super likeable, super charming, but underneath you're really quite manipulative. So she often exaggerated her capabilities and capacities to investors. She lied to these investors for, 11 years about her ability to design this technology and that she had people around her that could design this technology. Her leadership style was very autocratic, and there was really little room for questioning and collaboration, and anyone that did try and question her behaviour or technology was certainly gotten rid of. Employees described being surveillance, so that was the third point, was that she surveillanced people. And they were surveillanced at work, they were surveillanced outside of work if they were a problem. And she really created a toxic work environment where people were really scared to communicate with each other, but also she actually discouraged internal communication between staff because while each staff member only had a small amount of information, it was hard for them to piece together what was really going on and potentially for people to find out that this technology was not working. The fourth point that I made was that she was very emotionally detached, and she was very much about image control and controlling her image. And that mimicking of Steve Jobs, both in the way she dressed and in her demeanour, was, I think, something that she had adopted as important for her people to see her as a professional CEO who was creating a company that was going to change things. She even used that term, she wanted to change the world. It was interesting when she eventually went to court for fraud, her appearance had changed dramatically. Her hair was down. She wore outfits that represented her as a mother because before she was charged, she actually became pregnant. And so she presented herself as much more as a frail woman and as almost as a victim. And in fact, that's certainly what she portrayed in the court, and certainly blamed the company's fraudulent behaviour and why she behaved in the way she did on Sunny Balwani, her boyfriend at the time. I'm of the belief that she was the one that was manipulating the situation. I don't believe that he was the one controlling her. However, as a woman, it's very easy to play the victim. It's very easy to be the one saying, I was manipulated by someone else. But you only need to watch videos and interviews of her up until the point where she was arrested, and she was certainly not someone who was being manipulated by anyone. So the fifth point that I make about her behaviour, the board manipulation. So the manipulation of people not only went from the consumers through to the staff, it also went right up to the board. So she had a board that was filled with high profile but not medically experienced professionals, and these included people such as Henry Kissinger, George Shultz. These people invested millions of dollars into this company, believing that she could actually make this technology work. I will at this point say that I've watched a lot of stuff on Elizabeth. I've read the depositions and things like that. Although I believe that she manipulated the situation, that she did lie for a long time, that the technology was working when it wasn't, but I think she believed that although even if she couldn't design this technology, I believe that she thought she could find someone that could and could design it for her. And I think that's why she continued to pursue things and continued to pursue financial support for her campaign, because I think she actually believed someone else could do it. Unfortunately, This was the downside of her not knowing enough about this technology, that it just simply is not possible to run blood tests with a drop of blood. There are some tests that can, but certainly not all tests, which is what she claimed. So her behaviour was concerning, and really at a CEO level, what you rely on from an organisation or a company is that the board will have oversight and that the board will really understand what's going on to rein things in, especially when there's such a lot of money at stake. Unfortunately, the board really did not have a lot of oversight. Elizabeth really manipulated what the board knew and heard, and really any employees that did try and take things further with the board and explain to them that this is actually all a lie, that this technology is not working, were seen as just problem staff. They weren't seen as whistleblowers. They were just seen as people that were maybe jealous of Elizabeth. So that's just some of the behaviours that have been described by people that knew Elizabeth and worked alongside her. Now, given that the main reason for this podcast is to really talk about dark traits and dark behaviour, so I want to just have a little bit of a chat about how Elizabeth's behaviour, not Elizabeth herself, but her behaviour, might fit with that dark triad. So let's talk about psychopathy first. So from a psychopathic perspective, she was very emotionally detached. She really lacked empathy. She manipulated others, and she used her ability to deceive others, but didn't really have a lot of remorse for the damage that she did. There was a case of one woman who had gone to have a blood test done by one of Elizabeth's machines from Theranos, and she was told that she had lost her baby. She was no longer pregnant. Now, this woman had previously miscarried a baby, and she was absolutely distraught. It turned out she had not lost her baby and that she was actually still pregnant. And it was and there were multiple cases of people who had gotten misdiagnosed, either with things like cancer or not with cancer when they had cancer, that caused a lot of issues. And really, someone who is able to reflect on their own behaviour would not certainly put another human being through that kind of trauma and not feel any level of guilt. The company's excuse was that all blood tests have failures, and that they felt they were meeting that failure rate. I think the biggest thing that shows that Elizabeth displayed psychopathic behaviours was that she was very charming, she was very likeable, and she really was able to inflate her abilities through the way she spoke. She took no responsibility for anything she'd done. She didn't care that she'd conned people out of billions of dollars for technology that didn't work. She quite openly manipulated staff to lie about the fact that they weren't using these machines, that they were using third-party machines, and pretending that it was being done through her devices. So I think she does fit the psychopathic criteria, and I have heard psychologists talk about her in this aspect. I prefer to look at it more as the behaviour, not so much the person. Now let's talk about narcissism. So she did have a grandiose sense of self. That stemmed right back to where she decided to quit Stanford in her first year because she felt like she didn't need to actually have any kind of degree to undertake a company and design this technology. She was very obsessed with her public perception, and she really had this belief that she could change the world and that she was going to change the world. I think in many ways she displayed that level of narcissism through the fact that she continued to push forward even when the technology wasn't working. And I truly believe that she thought she could get someone else to actually design the technology for her, because really, there was always going to be a point where she was going to be found out. So it would be more beneficial for her to have someone design the technology than it would for the technology to not work, because it was inevitable that she would eventually get in trouble for that. Let's talk about Machiavellianism. So it's the third of the dark triad. So Machiavellianism is very much about people who have a desire for success and power. And you often see this in a lot of politicians. She did actually strategically manipulate people and systems for her personal gain. She misled investors, and she controlled the board by limiting their contact with the actual company itself and the staff. So I think it's safe to say that if you look at Elizabeth's behaviour, it does touch on many of these dark traits. Now, that said, like I said, this is just my opinion. This is just looking at some of those behaviours that we've seen displayed and described by people who've worked alongside her. I do not know Elizabeth personally, and I prefer to look at it as these are the behaviours that she's displayed that potentially fit under these categories. Elizabeth is serving time in prison at the time of recording this podcast for her fraudulent behaviour. I think Elizabeth Holmes' story is very powerful, and it's a very powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, and certainly unchecked ambition in women these days, that, we tell women they can do anything, they can break that glass ceiling, they can achieve whatever they want. So I think in some women there's become this inflated sense of self, and because she was absolutely idolised in Silicon Valley as this, like I said, the Silicon Darling, I think she was called, people couldn't look past that. They wanted her to succeed. They couldn't look past the fact that she actually was not doing what she said she was doing. People wanted to say, look at this young woman, look what she's achieved. She's created this billion-dollar company, and wow, this is someone that young women can live up to. Sadly, I'm sure there's a lot of women out there that can do that can live up to expectations and can be really great role models. Unfortunately, Elizabeth's story is not one of those. She lied, she manipulated, and her behaviour was clearly fraudulent, as the court had decided through that process. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. The Elizabeth story is quite fascinating and quite detailed, and I do suggest that you go out and do some more reading if it's something that does interest you. Yes, I highly recommend the Bad Blood podcast, which goes into a great amount of detail. Thanks for listening.